Khan, you've got Genesis.
But you don't have me. You are going to kill me, Khan. You're going to have to come down here. You're going to have to come down here.
I've done far worse than kill you. I've hurt you. And I wish to go on hurting you. I shall leave you as you left me, as you left her, marooned for all eternity in the center of a dead planet. Buried alive. Buried alive. Come! Come!
In a world overflowing with movies, we need a hero. Someone to separate the bad from the good.
Sounds like a job. Verbal diorama. Watches all the movies from comedy to drama. From the top roll sound. And don't forget the action. She'll watch until the end and then she'll give you her reaction. Movies you know, movies you don't. Prequels, sequels, remakes, and trivia and outtake. Movies you know, movies you don't. Interesting stories, all the categories.
Hi everyone, I'm Em and welcome to Verbal Diorama episode 266, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. This is the podcast that's all about the history and legacy of movies you know and movies you don't. And as always, hi, welcome to Verbal Diorama. Whether you are a regular returning listener, whether you are a brand new listener to this podcast, whether you're just a really big Trekkie, thank you for being here. Thank you for choosing to listen to this podcast. I am, as always, so happy to have you here for every episode, but especially for the history and legacy of Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. Honestly, I'm always still so blown away that people actually listen to this podcast and have listened to this podcast for the last 5 years or so. Thank you so much for your support. It means so much to me as a solo indie film podcaster who does this from a little box room in her house. Most recent episodes have included Cloverfield and Zoolander. And while I was on my week off recently, I decided to re-release a couple of older episodes on Logan and Deadpool. Why would I do that? Who cares about Deadpool and Wolverine right now, right? Anyway, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan comes so very soon after my episode on Star Trek, The Motion Picture. Mostly because the reception to that episode was really great, but also the pure fact that if it wasn't done now, it wouldn't be done until March 2025 at the earliest, because I have loads of other plans for the schedule for the podcast up until that point. And considering the positive reaction to that first movie episode, logic clearly dictated that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. That, and it's a fascinating story. So warp speed from episode 259 to episode 266. And here's the trailer for Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan.
Beyond the darkness, beyond the human evolution, is Khan, a genetically superior tyrant. Exiled to a barren planet, banished by a starship commander he is destined to destroy. Left for dead, he has survived.
I'll chase him round the moons of Nibia and round the Antares maelstrom and round perdition's flames before I give him up. There she is. There she is. Fire!
Shield's collapsing, Captain. Can you evade their power? A few shots, sir.
Not enough against their shields.
The base is stubborn.
Scotty, I need warp speed in 3 minutes or we're all dead.
worse than kill you. I've hurt you, and I wish to go on hurting you. I shall leave you as you left me, marooned for all eternity, buried alive, buried alive. Sean! Sean!
At the end of the universe lies the beginning of vengeance. Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan.
Admiral James T. Kirk is overseeing a simulator session of trainees on the starship USS Enterprise when it receives a distress call from the space station Regular One. Kirk must face a powerful adversary from his past, Khan Noonien Singh, a genetically engineered superhuman. Khan, who was exiled to a barren planet by Kirk years earlier, escaped and seeks revenge by seizing control of the USS Reliant. He plans to use the Genesis device, a powerful terraforming technology that can reorganize matter on a planetary scale as a weapon, and wants to take revenge on Kirk, whom he blames for the death of his wife. Let's run through the cast of this movie. We have William Shatner as James T. Kirk, Ricardo Montalban as Khan Noonien Singh, Leonard Nimoy as Spock, DeForest Kelley as Leonard McCoy, James Doohan as Montgomery Scott, George Takei as Hikaru Sulu, Walter Koenig as Pavel Chekhov, Nichelle Nichols as Aurora, Bibi Besh as Carol Marcus, Merritt Buttrick as David Marcus, Paul Winfield as Clark Terrell, and Kirstie Alley as Saavik. Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan has a screenplay by Jack B. Sowards, a story by Harve Bennett and Jack B. Sowards, was directed by Nicholas Meyer, and based on Star Trek by Gene Roddenberry. So, episode 259, that was only 7 episodes ago, I looked into the history and legacy of Star Trek the Motion Picture. Now, I need to ask a really important question. Have you listened to the episode on Star Trek the Motion Picture? If not, it might be a good idea, mostly because the making of that movie heavily influenced the making of this one. In fact, the whole idea for Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan was essentially to, quote, right the wrongs that happened on Star Trek the Motion Picture. So I would suggest you boldly go where you haven't gone before, pause this episode, and listen to that one if you can. If you can't, for whatever reason, here's the Cliff Notes version. In a nutshell, Paramount was disappointed by the financial gross of Star Trek the Motion Picture. It had a $44 million budget that included production expenses of a TV series called Star Trek Phase 2. Star Trek the Motion Picture was the most expensive film ever made in the United States at the time, and the studio blamed the slow pacing and underwhelming box office receipt on Gene Roddenberry's creative direction and script revisions, and the constant arguments behind the scenes between Gene Roddenberry and producer-screenwriter Harold Livingston. Although the motion picture's success persuaded the studio to support the less expensive sequel, Roddenberry would essentially be removed from creative control and demoted to executive consultant, which doesn't sound like much of a demotion, but it was considering his huge influence over that first movie. Paramount boss Barry Diller wanted a sequel as soon as possible, and Roddenberry had already started writing his idea for the second movie, which involved time travel and preventing JFK's assassination. This was rejected by Paramount when he was given his new title of executive consultant. His new title gave him an office on the Paramount lot and nominally the right to approve the sequel script, but he was no longer in charge, and any clout that he had was now gone. It's not the end of the story for Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan and Gene Roddenberry, but it's important to note that Star Trek was his baby. Paramount decided to enlist one of their new television producers, Harve Bennett, to a producer role for the sequel. Bennett was the showrunner of The $6 Million Man and The Bionic Woman, and he had never seen the original series. But after a meeting with Paramount executives Barry Diller, Michael Eisner, and Charles Bluhdorn, he was asked what he thought of Star Trek the Motion Picture. He replied truthfully, and clearly he had the balls to do so, that he found it boring. Could he do better? He was asked. Yes, he could. Could he do it cheaper? He was asked. Yes, he could definitely make a cheaper sequel, coming from TV where budgets were practically nothing. He stated he could make 5 movies for the price of that first one. He would set about watching Star Trek the original series and realised that the first movie lacked a cohesive villain, and that they could probably save money from that expensive first movie by reusing sets, special effects, models, and special effects sequences replayed wholesale. I am going to be coming back to all of that though. Unlike any other Star Trek movie, The Wrath of Khan was made under Paramount's television division rather than the theatrical division. And again, this is something that I'm going to come back to a bit later. Because Harve Bennett was also overseeing other projects, he wanted someone he trusted to oversee day-to-day on Star Trek 2 as a line producer, and he chose his old friend Robert Sallin. While Bennett made the ultimate decisions, it was Sallin who was on the ground, dealing with general issues. Both went back to school, they learned the series, they learned the characters, and the restrictions placed upon them by established events in canon. And as I said, they wanted to right the supposed wrongs of Robert Wise's 1979 Star Trek The Motion Picture. After watching the Star Trek episode Space Seed, Bennett decided the character Khan Noonien Singh would be a tangible antagonist. Space Seed tells the story of the Enterprise finding a dead spacecraft from 1996 drifting in deep space. An army of cryogenically frozen combatants from the eugenics wars, the last of the world wars, are on board the ship. After being awakened, Khan Noonien Singh, their leader, awakens the other members of his people and attempts to take control of the Enterprise until Kirk intervenes. They would take the ideas from this episode, and Bennett would write the first treatment, titled The War of the Generations, which included all the major plot points, the fact of Khan's involvement, a Federation-managed superweapon, and Kirk finding out he has a son. Second version, written by an actual Star Trek fan, Jack B. Sowards, titled The Omega Syndrome, would change the superweapon to a terraforming device, on the advice of newly appointed art director Michael Miner, and would change the name of that device from the Omega system to the Genesis device, referencing the biblical powers of the weapon. Sowards' draft, now renamed the Genesis Project, would also include the death of Spock in the first act. So, back to the previous episode of Star Trek The Motion Picture. Seriously, listen to it. It sets up so much of the story. But if I still can't persuade you to, Spock's involvement was very almost not a thing in Star Trek The Motion Picture due to ongoing lawsuits and issues surrounding Leonard Nimoy. And for the Star Trek Phase 2 TV series, which was the precursor to the motion picture, Spock was replaced with a new Vulcan character called Zon. But once those issues with Nimoy were resolved, Zon was removed from the script and Spock was reinstated. But it was no secret that Nimoy was kind of done with Star Trek by this point, and the idea that Spock would die in the first act was something that Bennett compared to Janet Leigh's death in Psycho, a move completely unexpected at the time and ramped up the shock value. Bennett and Sowards continued to work on the draft, creating a new Vulcan character called Sarvik, and at one point Samuel A. Peoples, a veteran Star Trek writer, had written a draft that replaced Khan entirely, but the new villains were deemed to be too typical of the TV series villain. All the while, Robert Sallin was struggling to find a director. Robert Wise declined the offer to return for the sequel, and to be fair, he'd done his fair share of work on that first movie. Most established directors didn't want to do Star Trek. Others didn't want to take on a sequel. Others didn't want to do science fiction, and those that wanted all three just simply weren't available. He approached 30 to 40 people, Ron Howard was approached, as well as several British directors, just in case a planned Directors Guild strike happened, one of which was Hugh Hudson, who was making Chariots of Fire. Sallin thought he would make a great Star Trek movie, but Paramount disagreed. They were still working on the screenplay at this point, and there were still issues with the screenplay, and Nicholas Meyer was brought on board to help resolve them. He had also never seen an episode of Star Trek. This is a general theme. And with the People's script removing everything the team thought was great, it took them a while to get back to Meyer with a version of the script that he could then work on. But once he got this script, he just understood the assignment immediately. and Sallin and Bennett met with him and offered him the chance to direct. Not only that, he also did an uncredited rewrite on the script and rewrote it in just 12 days. A rewrite that would ultimately save the franchise and ensure The Wrath of Khan would become one of the most beloved entries, if not the most beloved entry in the franchise. I am kind of getting ahead of myself a little bit here, so let's rewind. Because there was another problem. Leonard Nimoy had publicly said he would not return as Spock, but Harve Bennett knew that doing Star Trek without him was unthinkable. He didn't have many cards to play, so decided to play to Nimoy's vanity. They'd previously worked together on a TV movie for Universal, so he called Nimoy, asked to meet over lunch and catch up like old friends do. But Nimoy was a bit more savvy than that, and realised Bennett was on Paramount's charm offensive to get Nimoy back into those Vulcan ears. That lunch was never scheduled, but a few months later, Bennett was invited to Nimoy's home for a social gathering. And while Bennett was making small talk and waiting for the opportunity to ask Nimoy about Star Trek II, Nimoy beat him to the punch and asked him how it was all going. Bennett, knowing he had to appeal to Nimoy's desire to be seen as a serious actor, asked him if he wanted to have a great death scene. And that was it. Nimoy was like that Leonardo DiCaprio, "You had my curiosity, but now you have my attention" meme. Nimoy wanted that dramatic finale for his character, a definitive exit with the gravitas he craved. It suited both of them. It sated Nimoy's desire to be done with the franchise and gave Bennett the opportunity to make Star Trek the way he wanted to, with the series' most iconic character in play. No one would see Spock's death coming. Let's put a pin in that. We're going to come back to it. This would be a story about aging, regrets, moving on, and death, with a crew that was growing older and coming to terms with their mortality. It would also introduce fresh-faced cadets like Savit, as well as a long-lost son for Kirk. Nicholas Meyer had saved the script, Leonard Nimoy was on board, and Meyer's uncredited and free-of-charge rewrite hadn't just saved the script, it had also saved the visual effects. The script was titled Star Trek II: The Undiscovered Country, a reference to Hamlet's to be or not to be speech. And when I say it saved the visual effects, Paramount had contracted Industrial Light and Magic for the visual effects. And if they didn't have a completed script within 12 days, they wouldn't meet the studio's release plans. But Nicholas Meyer had done that completed script in that 12-day period, and everything was now fine. The script, the special effects deadline, and now thanks to a new 2-picture contract with Paramount, specifically for 2 non-Star Trek pictures, Leonard Nimoy would now be returning for Star Trek II. But then, a catastrophe happened. Because, while all of this was going on, Gene Roddenberry had a very hands-off role, but he kept his eyes on what was going on. And boy, was he unhappy. He had read the Genesis Project's draft script, and on the 28th of April 1981, would write a sternly worded letter to Harve Bennett, expressing his displeasure. 9 pages of it. No idea if it was front and back, but it was typed on a typewriter, so possibly not. But in essence, Roddenberry's complaints about the script included the death of Spock and the fact the basic storyline departed considerably from Star Trek's winning formula. And he would list Star Trek's unique qualities within the letter, as well as complain the film violated the principle of perfected humans in an optimistic future. He would add, quote, "I know that these format errors are inadvertent on your part. There is too much evidence in this script of your efforts to tie the movie to the Star Trek past and your efforts to keep the same character relationships and much more. Please understand in turn that it is because Star Trek is decidedly difficult to execute and I am trying to be helpful," unquote. But these concerns fell on deaf ears, and so Roddenberry then decided to take the matter even further. To the fans. And while he would always deny it, he allegedly leaked the script at fan conventions, allegedly via his long-term associate Susan Sackett. And his plan was to harness the fandom to express outrage at what was happening to their beloved franchise. And they did. They wrote letters, and the thing that fans were most annoyed about was the death of Spock. Sackett would reportedly tell fans that if they wanted change, they needed to convince Paramount to reverse the idea. Fans took out ads in the Daily Variety and the Hollywood Reporter, demanding to know why Paramount was deliberately jeopardizing $28 million in revenue. Whilst Roddenberry would always deny he leaked the script, a code on the leaked script was the exact code on the script that was only given to Gene Roddenberry. Whether it was him or whether it was Susan Sackett, who would have had access to that script, I guess we'll never truly know. But as we know about fandom, some fans took that anger a bit further than necessary, directing death threats to not only producer Robert Sallin, who received threatening phone calls to his home and had to employ security for his family, as was the sustained campaign of hate he received. Ironically, fans also sent death threats to Leonard Nimoy, which seems counterproductive if they actually want him to play Spock. But it was Nicholas Meyer who saw the fan fever over Spock's untimely death and decided to troll them back a little by faking his death in the Kobayashi Maru sequence and move his death to the end of the movie. That way, they would see the movie, see Spock die, but then see it's all a training exercise. Paramount worried it would affect the profits. Some conspiracy theories thought Paramount had leaked it for publicity. But Roddenberry's leak would turn out to be a blessing in disguise. It would be a leak that would unwittingly give more pathos to the third act climax and cement Star Trek II as one of the great sequels of all time. But at the time, it was akin to some sort of national mourning. It became national news, with Entertainment Tonight conducting a poll on whether burying Spock was a good idea. The poll said overwhelmingly it was not. And at the time, it seemed like the damage was irrevocable. But hey, at least Leonard Nimoy was on board, as were the rest of the established cast. But while Bennett had prioritised making Nimoy happy, other cast members weren't impressed with their roles, or indeed lack thereof. George Takei complained that Sulu was only a bit part, saying he was a, quote, talking prop, unquote. Similarly, DeForest Kelley said that his role as Bones was, quote, not meaningful, unquote. But really, the biggest complaint came from William Shatner, whose role was just as important as Nimoy's, and he would call for an immediate meeting with Bennett and Meyer about Meyer's script, stating he was ready and willing to walk away unless certain changes were made to the character of Kirk. But not only was Nicholas Meyer a world-class troller of fans thinking Spock's Kobayashi Maru death was the death scene they were so worried about, he was also a diplomatic problem solver, and he made sure that both Takei and Kenny were happy with their newly beefed up parts. He also addressed Shatner's issues, rewriting the part to be more heroic. It would be a completed script that could easily be edited on the fly if needed. The movie's supporting cast would be rounded out by Merritt Buttrick, who had died tragically from AIDS at age 29 in 1989, as Kirk's son David. Bibi Besh was added to play David's mother, Genesis Project scientist Carol Marcus, and Kirstie Alley made her big screen debut, donning pointy ears to play the stoic Vulcan cadet Saavik, originally male in the first incarnations of the script, but now female and, importantly, half Vulcan, half Romulan. But the most important addition, well, 15 years after he'd first played him, was Ricardo Montalban as Khan. He was mostly known as Mr. Rourke in Fantasy Island, and now 61 years of age, but as it turned out, the guy was completely jacked. Montalban was elated to return to the character of Khan, and he rewatched Space Seed to get reacquainted with the character. But at this point, the movie was still called Star Trek II: The Undiscovered Country. But they didn't think that sounded grandiose enough. Paramount's New York-based head of marketing, Frank Mancuso, vetoed the title and rechristened the film Star Trek II: The Vengeance of Khan. It was thought that vengeance would sell tickets, of course. But this was done without Nicholas Meyer's consent, and he hated the new title. The pair had stern words about it. It was then changed to The Wrath of Khan, but he also hated that title too. Of course, Meyer would go on to use his beloved The Undiscovered Country for Star Trek VI, which he also directed. But going back to Star Trek the Motion Picture, because literally everything on this movie goes back to Star Trek the Motion Picture, and righting the supposed wrongs of that movie, especially when it came to the expense of it, and the issues with the visual effects, and the whole Robert Abel and Associates debacle. So, seriously, I can't stress it enough. Listen to that episode if you haven't. But after Robert Abel was fired for spending millions and producing nothing, it was Douglas Trumbull and John Dykstra's Apogee Productions that saved the day, creating miniature models and working non-stop for 7 months on Star Trek the Motion Picture. When it came to the newly christened The Wrath of Khan, the modest budget was kept modest, and the team at Industrial Light and Magic were, as I previously mentioned, already contracted for the work, which meant Douglas Trumbull wasn't asked to return for the sequel to the movie his team worked so hard on. ILM would reach out to Trumbull to ask for assistance, but Trumbull refused. Luckily, Paramount had held on to all previous sets and models, all of which were stored in a hangar. Both the mothballed set of the ship's bridge and the 8-foot-long Enterprise model were taken out of dry dock and repurposed. The Reliant ship, which Khan hijacks, would have money spent on a miniature model, but its interiors would ultimately be the same as that of the Enterprise, albeit with darker lighting and a more run-down appearance. Originally, the Reliant was conceived as a Constitution-class starship, identical to the Enterprise, but it was felt audiences would have difficulty distinguishing between twin ships, especially during the battle scene in the Mataran Nebula. The model Reliant was lighter than the Enterprise model, had less complex internal wiring. The Enterprise was big and it was heavy. It took 8 people to mount the model and a forklift truck to move it. The Dykstra Flex motion control system was used for filming the miniature photography shots of the Enterprise and the other ship exteriors. ILM would work wonders with what little budget they had for visual effects. For example, the brief scene in which we witness the Genesis device bringing life to an empty planet became the first sequence in a feature film to be entirely computer-generated. In fact, the only thing not cut back on cost-wise was the aforementioned CGI. The large terraforming sequence could only be done with animation, and much like the sequence in the finished film, it was presented as an advertisement for the skills of Lucasfilm computer imaging. The clip impressed a young Steve Jobs enough to part with $5 million to buy out the division. That division would eventually become Pixar. That is how important this movie is. The widely disliked costumes from the motion picture were re-dyed dark red and used again for The Wrath of Khan. Basically, if anything from the motion picture could be reused, whether it was costumes, models, sets, props, or visual effects, it was reused. This is the ultimate in movie recycling. Now, as a non-horror kind of person, especially a non-body horror kind of person, I can't watch the SETI eels. It just elicits a very visceral response from me. But I also love how they did the SETI eels, because regular listeners will know how much I love practical effects. So I'm very conflicted about that scene. The idea, like so many on this movie, came from Robert Sallin. He is genuinely the MVP of this movie. He went out to pick up his newspaper one day and saw a slug on the path. What if it could get into your ear and control your mind, he thought. The literal stuff of nightmares. Something that would be realised in film in the 1988 cheesy horror movie Slugs, which, bizarrely, I have seen and I care to never see again. Visual effects supervisor Ken Ralston, who had recently completed creature design for Return of the Jedi, oversaw the creation of multiple models for the SETI eel shots, but the concept art included creatures with legs and tentacles. The design chosen by Sallin was a segmented, almost beetle larva-looking creature with its own larvae nestling on its back, and it would be the larvae that was used by Khan. The full-grown creature was a latex puppet operated from below, but the larvae were covered in translucent substance to make them slimy. This was, apparently, raspberry jam. Ralston seemingly took inspiration for the movements from David Cronenberg's Shivers, with his own slug-like parasites that overtake their human hosts and turn them into sex maniacs. Obviously, there are no sex maniacs in Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan, spoiler alert. In order to move the models slowly across the actors' faces and into their ears, they tied microfilament to the larvae, and this was threaded through the set's floor to Koenig's ear to replicate the scene of a more mature eel exiting Chekhov's ear. 3 takes of this scene were recorded, according to Ralston. They were a dry shot, one with some blood, and the Fangoria shot with a lot of gore. A huge model of Koenig's ear was shown in test screenings, but that footage was cut from the theatrical release because of the visceral response it caused, which is not surprising because the idea of any creature entering or exiting the human body really does strike at a primal level of fear and loathing. On the 9th of November 1981, principal photography on The Wrath of Khan would finally begin. The soundstage being used for the movie was completely knocked down on the Paramount lot. But what was there to protect now that Spock's passing was widely known? The majority of the first 5 days of filming were devoted to capturing Khan and his motley crew of Botany Bay survivors on board the Reliant. Montalban acknowledged that his first day on set, he was utterly terrified. Then a few days later, the main cast began filming, despite George Takei's refusal to sign his contract because he still wasn't convinced about the extent of Sulu's role in the film. He obviously would eventually sign. Because of the reuse of the Enterprise set as the Reliant and Khan's scene being shot first before the Reliant set was redressed as the Enterprise, with Shatner and the Enterprise crew then shooting their scenes, it would mean both Ricardo Montalban and William Shatner never actually met on set at all, with both having to deliver their lines to stand-ins. It would be a huge regret for both actors to never have met in person during filming, considering how iconic their pairing would become. Stage 8, the largest soundstage at Paramount Studios, was used to simulate the desolate desert surface of SETI Alpha 5. Tons of coloured sand and powder were thrown over wooden mats that covered the set, which was raised 25 feet above the ground. Huge industrial fans created a sandstorm, and a painted cyclorama was wrapped around the set. Both the crew and the actors found the filming to be incredibly uncomfortable. Walter Koenig and Paul Winfield's spandex environmental suits lacked ventilation, so the actors had to use microphones to indicate when they needed air. To avoid mechanical issues, filming equipment was covered in plastic, and everyone on set wore coveralls, masks, and boots to protect themselves from flying sand. And considering the fan backlash, the fake-out death, and Paramount's wobble at even having Spock die at all, when it came to filming Spock's actual death scene, Leonard Nimoy was so overcome with emotion during the filming of Spock's final sacrifice, so much so he almost walked off set. Members of the cast and crew were breaking into tears during filming the first take. On the second take, Nimoy was asked to improv something mysterious to give fans a vague shred of hope. So he improvised the Vulcan mind meld with Bones. Following a 12-week shoot that concluded in February 1982, Meyer received word that The Wrath of Khan was scheduled by Paramount to open in theatres on the 12th of June 1982, which left very little time for the editing process. He would work non-stop for 7 weeks and would end up cutting 2 subplots from the movie for pacing reasons, one about Scotty's nephew and the other involving a romantic relationship between Saavik and Kirk's son David. During this time, ILM was still working on the special effects, but Meyer had shrewdly reused some Enterprise footage from the original film. I mean, it's not like there wasn't enough of it to go around, right? James Horner had been chosen to score the movie, which was yet to be recorded, but Meyer had a rough cut ready to show Paramount executives. 9 weeks before the movie was due to open, he screened it for Barry Diller, Michael Eisner, and Jeffrey Katzenberg. And Barry Diller gave some very interesting feedback indeed. His feedback, after he watched this rough cut of the movie, was, "You can't kill Spock." He claimed he had no idea the movie was about Spock's death. Barry Diller hated the idea, but by that point the film had been shot, with Leonard Nimoy under the impression he would not be returning. 5 weeks later, a preview screening took place in Kansas City, attended by the host of The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson. Carson monologued the following evening on The Tonight Show, simply saying, "He dies." And once again, absolute carnage. Everyone knew who he was. And with the movie 4 weeks away from general release, Paramount's PR department started suggesting there was more than one ending to the movie, even though there wasn't. Even though Leonard Nimoy would definitely, 100%, never ever be getting back together with the Enterprise crew ever again. After all, Spock's coffin had been jettisoned into space, Kirk had given a moving eulogy, Saavik had shed tears of emotion, and Nimoy would never be back. Paramount had an emergency meeting, and Eisner suggested a resurrection in the finale, an Easter morning after Good Friday. Harve Bennett took that idea, and Sallin created the idea of Spock's coffin landing on the newly formed lush green Genesis planet, shot at San Francisco's Golden Gate Park. I told you, this is one hell of a story, and it's been absolutely fascinating to research for this episode. But I am going to segue into the obligatory Keanu reference of this episode. And if you don't know what that is, it's where I link the movie then featuring with Keanu Reeves for no reason other than he is the best of men, and he always deserves a bit of a mention in this podcast. You have no idea how hard this has been for me. This is scraping the barrel, but it's a barrel that needs scraping, so this is where I'm going. Keanu was fan cast as Spock on like a single website back in the day for the Kelvinverse. This was the role that eventually went to Zachary Quinto. And that's it. That's literally the only way I could link Keanu Reeves to The Wrath of Khan. How else would I have done it? If you've got any suggestions as to how I could have done it, please let me know. But that's it. It was literally one fancast website that has an article about Keanu Reeves as Spock. Talk about this movie cost-cutting. This is cost-cutting the obligatory Keanu reference. But cost-cutting was key to everything on this movie, and that included the score as well. This meant ditching the expensive Jerry Goldsmith and replacing him with someone considerably cheaper. John Morgan was considered, but was too inexperienced. James Horner was a fairly new composer who'd already worked with Roger Corman, Oliver Stone, and Wes Craven, and the Star Trek producers were impressed by his score for Wolfen. Horner took inspiration from nautical tones, borrowed excerpts from Prokofiev's Alexander Nevsky, as well as John Williams' Star Wars score and Goldsmith's score for the motion picture, but was told explicitly to not reuse any of Goldsmith's score. The full score for Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan was written in just 4 weeks, and far from it being a rushed job, it was so influential that parts of it were still being used for various projects throughout the 80s. If you think you've heard it elsewhere, you probably have, and Horner reused most of the score again for Aliens. The soundtrack was Horner's first major film score, and I've spoken a lot about my love for Horner's other scores in previous episodes, namely The Rocketeer, Krull, and Willow. Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan, released on the 4th of June 1982, opening at number 1, with at the time the largest opening weekend gross in history, of $14.3 million. This was the same week Poltergeist came out, that's episode 227 of this podcast. Poltergeist was third at the box office that first week. The second week, though, like everything, it was obliterated by E.T. the Extraterrestrial and had to make do with second place. That's the week Grease 2 came out, by the way, the superior Grease. That's episode 171. Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan did gross less than Star Trek The Motion Picture did. The motion picture ended up grossing $82 million domestically in the US. Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan would make $78.9 million domestically. Worldwide, Star Trek The Motion Picture ended up grossing $139 million. Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan would make $97 million. The Wrath of Khan became the 6th highest grossing movie of 1982. The motion picture was the 5th highest grossing movie of 1979. But, importantly, The Wrath of Khan was almost 3 times cheaper to make, meaning that ultimately it was way more profitable than Star Trek The Motion Picture was. And while the fan response before release was akin to something we might see on the internet nowadays, Star Trek fans not only showed up for The Wrath of Khan, they loved what they saw. It's widely considered the highest point of the entire franchise by both fans and critics. And critics have given it an 86% on Rotten Tomatoes, and after the muted response to the motion picture, The Wrath of Khan was credited with renewing interest in the franchise, giving a mature story about aging, friendship, revenge, and sacrifice. Now, Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan was followed by a lot of Star Trek movies. Star Trek III The Search for Spock in 1984, so he did return after all. Shock horror. Star Trek IV The Voyage Home in 1986. Star Trek V The Final Frontier in 1989. Star Trek VI The Undiscovered Country in 1991. With Star Trek Generations following in 1994, Star Trek First Contact in 1996, Star Trek Insurrection in 1998, and Star Trek Nemesis in 2002. The series was rebooted in 2009 in an alternative timeline created by Spock, with Star Trek 2009 followed by Star Trek Into Darkness in 2013 and Star Trek Beyond in 2016. A fourth movie has been talked about for years but has never materialised. Star Trek Into Darkness generated its own amount of fan controversy with the character of John Harrison, played by Benedict Cumberbatch. And spoilers, I guess, for the movie, but it is 11 years old now, and if you know, you know, but his reveal as Khan was one of the worst kept secrets in Hollywood at the time. And unsurprisingly, that movie drew a significant amount from Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. And one of the things that I love the most about doing this podcast is learning the stories that fundamentally the hardcore fans do know these stories. I am not telling hardcore fans anything that they don't already know. But for general lay people such as myself, who don't really know much about Star Trek, I have found it absolutely fascinating to look at the history and legacy of these movies and of Star Trek in general. But the most important thing that I take from this movie is the importance of key people working on this movie. And the biggest one, I think, is Robert Sallin, who was responsible for so many great decisions on this movie. And I wondered what happened to him after, because who produces something like this and then seemingly disappears? His IMDb lists only a handful of directorial credits, mostly in TV between 1978 and 1985, one second unit director credit in 1995, and obviously producer on Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. So what happened to such a promising producer? Well, Paramount wanted him to stick around for the now inevitable third movie in the franchise, but at the expense of Harve Bennett. Bennett, who had brought Sallin onto Star Trek II, was more lucrative to them as a television producer, and while Star Trek II had been produced by the studio's TV division, the next movie was going to be shifted back to the feature film department. Sallin staying on for Star Trek III would mean taking the producer role away from Bennett, and he couldn't do that to his old friend and colleague, despite the arguments that they'd had during production, and they had many, apparently. Sallin stepped away from Star Trek, and Bennett would produce a further 3 Star Trek movies: Star Trek III: The Search for Spock, Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, and Star Trek V: The Final Frontier. Sallin was a decent, honourable man, and because of that, the Star Trek franchise boldly went on. He should be more well known, and it's a shame he isn't. His role saved the franchise and set it on a brand new course. They set out to right the perceived wrongs of the motion picture, and fundamentally, they did, and it was mostly due to him. And he also helped generate legions of devoted fans. But obviously, it's not just him. Nicholas Meyer is also a bit of an underrated gem for this movie, which is weird to say when he's the director. But him understanding the underpinnings of Star Trek straight away means this movie continues to endure. It's almost unheard of now for a director to take on such a big IP like this without knowing anything about the lore. But first Robert Wise and now Nicholas Meyer just doing Star Trek for lols by bringing back an established for one episode villain in Khan, and having an actor like Ricardo Montalban, an actor who could really act, and an actor who definitely does not have a prosthetic chest. Yes, people genuinely did think his pecs were fake. This is despite the movie ignoring the fact that Khan and Chekhov never actually met, because Walter Koenig wouldn't be cast on Star Trek the original series until the following season. But that's by the by. I am always fascinated on this podcast how stuff is made, but often how stuff isn't made. How random things, happenstances, strange occurrences, even sometimes with malicious intent, just happen to make a movie happen. Gene Roddenberry wasn't happy he was forced off his project. He genuinely thought he could use the power of fandom to revolt against the production. It is ultimately kind of giving the finger to Gene Roddenberry, which is unfair, because he did create this world, he did create these characters. But it also sometimes proves that just because you are the creator doesn't necessarily mean you are the best influence for the film version of that project. William Shatner, obviously famous for his shouting of the name Khan, is really good in this movie. You genuinely believe in his arrogance and his refusal to believe in no-win scenarios, even though he bested the Kobayashi Maru, as it turns out, by cheating the system. The Wrath of Khan finally gives Kirk a test he can't cheat his way out of, and he has to come to terms with his inadequacies as a leader and also as a friend. And Leonard Nimoy, who wanted to be done with Spock so badly, he wanted to be killed off. Until he didn't anymore. But I guess that's a story for another episode because, spoiler alert, the third movie is titled The Search for Spock. And it is also directed by Leonard Nimoy. So Nimoy's ability to leverage his part and his future directing ambitions seemingly knew no bounds, and good for him. Gene Roddenberry thought he could get the fans on his side, but the fans loved this movie once they saw the significance of Spock's death and a tease at his resurrection. Star Trek the Motion Picture may have been the first, but Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan was the saviour, and even future Star Trek films and TV shows are still turning to it for inspiration. There's also the small matter of the home video market, which in the mid-80s was dominated by the VHS versus Betamax wars. I'm not going to go into it, there's so much on the internet about this, but Betamax was the better quality, but VHS players were cheaper. The tapes, on the other hand, were not. As an example, a VHS copy of Star Wars regularly retailed at $100. Star Trek II was promoted by a US VHS release of the original series episode Space Seed at the low price of just $29.99. The front of that tape even promoted the release as the episode that inspired Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan. And this VHS tape sold by the bucket load. And bear in mind at the time, people didn't buy VHS tapes. People rented VHS tapes. Paramount would then release Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan on VHS for $39.95, about $40 less than the average price of a VHS tape. This was seen as a huge risk for Paramount at the time, mostly, as I said, because people rented their tapes. And they never bought them, and this was because of the elevated prices. But their gamble paid off, and they sold 120,000 copies and bragged about making buyers out of renters. It was a massive promotional push by Paramount, who would then lower the price of other VHS tapes, like Top Gun, to $26.95 to record-breaking sales. No, I'm not going to say anything ridiculous like Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan helped VHS beat Betamax. But what it did do is it definitely helped VHS tapes become slightly more dominant than Betamax tapes. Now, obviously, there is another reason why VHS tapes were more popular than Betamax, but this is a family podcast, so I am not going to go into it. Again, have a look on the internet. There's lots of information there. Another thing that I've realised about talking about Star Trek is that Star Trek fans, despite the fact that I mentioned that some of them did send death threats, they are some of the most lovely, gracious, and open-minded fans in the world. Doing the previous episode proved that to me because I got so many lovely comments. Back in 1981, they were not happy about the movie. They almost derailed it, had Paramount not stood firm. But this movie was pioneering for so many reasons. For the first computer-generated sequence, for resurrecting Star Trek, for almost killing Spock, after that 1981 campaign of spite and threats to the team behind their decision. I guess it just goes to show that toxic fandom is not a new thing. Toxic fandom has existed throughout fandom, but I personally am very pleased to say that the Star Trek fans that I have associated with and that I've gotten to know over this little journey that I'm having with Star Trek have overwhelmingly been lovely people. But when you routinely have fights and arguments on Twitter with certain fandoms against certain fandoms and certain fandoms even against their own fandom, when fandoms are sending death threats to producers and actors, you do have to question that maybe, just maybe, fans aren't always right. Thank you for listening. As always, I would love to hear your thoughts on Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan. And as always, thank you for your continued support of this podcast. If you do enjoy listening and you love this podcast as much as I love this podcast, which isn't possible, by the way, because I've been doing this podcast 5 years, so I love it like I was a SETI eel and it was my SETI eel larvae. But if you do love this podcast and you want to help it grow, please take a moment to leave a rating or review wherever you found this podcast. It really genuinely does help. You can also find me on social media. I'm at Verbal Diorama on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, and Letterboxd. You can find posts, you can like posts, you can follow me, you can repost posts, literally anything you can help to do to get the word out. Followers on social media did a great job of getting the word out for Star Trek the Motion Picture, so I have my fingers crossed that if you have enjoyed this episode and you've reached this point and I'm still talking in your ears about please share this episode, that maybe you might log into your social media account and just click share or like or whatever, just to kind of give me a bit of a boost. And obviously the easiest thing you can do is if you have a friend or family member who does enjoy Star Trek and is very genuinely interested about the making of Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, then direct them to this episode, direct them to this podcast. There are a lot of episodes out there, and a lot of people are just getting to know this podcast, and it's been so lovely. I've had such lovely DMs on my Instagram and emails from people recently who have just found out about this podcast. People have been so genuinely nice to me. It's really given me a bit of a boost recently. So please spread the word about this podcast. And if you like this episode of Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, and you haven't listened to Star Trek the Motion Picture, which only came out 7 episodes ago, I realise you've kind of missed the boat now because you've listened to this, but I would highly recommend you go back and listen to that. Even if you've not seen Star Trek the Motion Picture, the story of the making of that movie is so important to the story of this one. It really would make a great double episode pairing. So that is the only episode I'm going to recommend. So that is episode 259, Star Trek the Motion Picture. The next episode, If It Bleeds, We Can Kill It. Up next on Verbal Diorama is John McTiernan's terrific science fiction movie, one of Arnold Schwarzenegger's defining roles as Major Dutch Schaefer, and the debut of one of cinema's most recognisable alien creatures, with obviously the legendary Stan Winston's creature effects, hunting down a group of elite paramilitaries in the Central American rainforest. The next episode is on the history and legacy of 1987's Predator. So please join me next week for a very fun episode with very little swears. I don't know how I'm going to get clips from that movie because they swear a lot in that movie. But I recently rewatched it today and it's so much fun and I'm so excited to talk about Predator. This podcast is free and it always will be free. However, if you have the means to support this podcast and you wish to do so, you can do in one of two ways. You could go to verbaldiorama.com/tips and give a one-off tip. Or you can go to verbaldiorama.com/Patreon and you can join the amazing patrons of this podcast. They are Sade, Claudia, Simon, Laurel, Derek, Kat, Andy, Mike, Luke, Michael, Scott, Brendan, Lisa, Sam, Jack, Dave, Stuart, Nicholas, So, Kev, Pete, Heather, Danny, Ali, Stu, Brett, Philip, Michelle, Zenos, Sean, Rhino, Russell, and brand new patron, Philip K. Thank you so much, Philip, for joining. I hope you enjoy your time with us. And if you want to get in touch with me, you can email me, verbaldiorama@gmail.com. I do love getting emails and messages from people. So if you do want to get in touch with me and you want to talk about any of the movies that I featured on this podcast, please feel free to do so because I do genuinely reply to all of the emails. And you can find out the bits and pieces that I do over at Film Stories. I have the magazine and I have articles that I write for as well. And finally,
Ship. Out of danger.
Yes.
Don't grieve, Admiral. It is logical. The needs of the many outweigh
The needs of the few.
or the one. I never took the Kobayashi Maru test until now. What do you think of my solution?
Spock.
I have been, and always shall be, your friend.
bye.
Movies you know, movies you don't. Prequel, sequel,